Hello, hello. Hello, hello, and welcome. Hello, hello, and welcome to our first lesson of 2026. This is our lesson on masculinity for A Streetcar Named Desire, one of our texts we have been looking at for A-level English, for Key Stage 5 English more broadly, for my Ed Spaces free streams that have been coming to you all year from me and from our other A-level teachers. Across the year there will be free streams for content for you, whether this is one of your many times you've signed in to join us. Hello IGCSE, thank you for joining us again. Or if this is your first your first time joining, these free streams will be taking place across the year, not just with English, but with all of your subjects to help you get the depth and breadth needed, not necessarily something that you are always able to access in an A-level classroom due to the constraints of time. So here we are to give you a bit more support, a bit more stretch, a bit more challenge with your A-level study of literature. And this is actually our 7th lesson with A Streetcar Named Desire. We will be doing, after today, 3 more lessons on A Streetcar Named Desire on different themes. We've already looked at the plot, the context of the play with the New and Old South, for example. We've looked at the major characters, so Blanche, Stella, Stanley, and Mitch, as well as deep dived into not just who they are in one dimension, but in many, many different dimensions that we've got to look at them, and thus many different arguments that we can generate about these different characters. And today we're going to be looking at masculinity, which is one of our key themes that comes up, and we'll also be looking at how we could use a paragraph or two about masculinity in a different question in order to add a bit of complexity to our understanding of a question, for example, about identity, which is really broad, or about relationships between men and women, which is also a very common one in its different wordings to have for A Streetcar Named Desire, is relationships between people, especially for AQA, where we've got the Love Through the Ages paper, and it always asks you about some kind of negotiation, love, sex, desire, power, longing, etc., to do with the relationships between the people here. So let's get into it. If this is your first lesson with us, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the English teachers at my Ed Space, and a bit about my qualifications, but most of you, as I can see on the chat, already have joined us before. So let's get started with masculinity, and let's just brainstorm, because if you had this as a question, or if you had this as a piece of revision material, you want to think firstly, okay, what do I know? So for example, first thing that comes to mind for me, with masculinity is power, right? Power and dominance. Here, put in the chat anything else that comes to mind when we think about masculinity in A Streetcar Named Desire. I think as well, for example, about sex and sexuality, with the caveats of this about rape and dominance, again, by force. Think of this as desire. And then think about this as perhaps some kind of either control or power dynamic here, even between loving couples like Stella and Stanley. With this as well, we can also think of masculinity as linked to violence, right? We have Stanley smashing plates, hitting people, tearing things, causing a scene here. And this violence can be both physical as well as sexual here. So again, tying these ideas together. Sexual. there. We have it as destructive, again linked to this idea of violence is destructive masculinity. We have masculinity as performative, toxic masculinity, Ben. So performativity, yes, public facing. If we're thinking about public facing in a play, we have to think about audience participation. So audience and complicity, who are we meant to side with here? Yeah. No, Ben, you're absolutely right. I'm not thinking about masculinity outside of the realm of the play. We're thinking about it as within the play. Not that our view of masculinity in the real world is, but within the play, yes, I would say that masculinity is linked to violence here. But this would be linked again to destructiveness here, which is probably how you would say it in a written format, just because it sounds a little bit less psychology and a little bit more kind of consequence based, which is what we would want to think about with this play and with playwriting in general. We also want to think about, with performativity in particular, other men and the relationships between men in the play. So for example, we've got Mitch here, which presents a very different kind of masculinity to Stanley. Mitch is a kind of, as some critics describe, beta compared to Stanley's alpha energy. If we think about masculinity, we've got to think about Stanley, right? So he is a different kind of masculinity here. We also want to think about things like patriarchy here as well. Here, and perhaps linking to context, we've got, for example, post-World War II reality for women. We've got the start of second wave feminism. Definitely. We've got ideas like colourful in A Streetcar Named Desire. All of the men are described as wearing colourful clothing, particularly primary colours, and being linked to colours compared to Blanche, who is always linked to whiteness and greyness. Further from this, we've got ideas of the idea of punishment. We've got volatility. Which is the idea of Stanley in particular exploding or reacting very suddenly. Later, we also have this to a lesser extent with Mitch. We also have ideas of punishment here. Idea of voice and dialogue being played here. We've got symbols such as the poker cards, we've got the red pajamas, we've got the work clothes, we've got ideas such as light, colour, music. Here they're all linked to masculine sexuality and masculinity more broadly in the play. So you can see we've got quite a lot here, right? Of course, when we think about masculinity, that's one side of a two-sided coin here, because if we're thinking about masculinity, we can think about femininity as well, but we want to be careful that we're not then making this an essay about femininity. Instead, we need to use our ideas that we may have planned for femininity or for womanhood. So if we'd really wanted to set, and we'd set our mind to, in the play, talking about Blanche and Stella, We could still do, but we have to think about them within the capacity of their relationship to Stanley and to Mitch. We have to center it on Stanley and Mitch, but use them as contrasts or to inform the way masculinity is represented, because masculinity and femininity are responsive to each other, right? Hello, India. Thank you for joining us. And these ideas are interesting because they don't just appear as masculinity broadly. And I think that's where some people panic with A-level questions, and they sort of think, oh, well, I don't actually know what to say for this question. And what we just need to do is be tactical about what the question is asking us, which is that, for example, if we have a question about Mitch or we have a question about Stanley, we can focus some of our ideas on their presentation of masculinity and spend other paragraphs talking about their relationships, for example, with Blanche, or their trajectory, for Mitch, the relationship with his mother, etc. Because that gives us not only depth within our paragraph, so we can get into a lot of detail, but it also gives us focus between the different paragraphs, right? We can't just talk about masculinity as toxic or masculinity as powerful or strong for 5 paragraphs. It will become repetitive. So instead, what we need to do is focus on different elements of masculinity, and thus bring this, for example, bring masculinity's relationship to sex and sexuality as one of our paragraphs. Its idea about power and dominance as another paragraph. A paragraph about violence. Even this idea of audience complicity, because if we think about it, the ending has us championing masculinity rather than femininity, or Blanche's character particularly, because Stanley survives and Blanche doesn't. So unfortunately, even if we don't want to, we're left with thinking about Stanley and his way of life as championing at the end of the play. So this is what it could look like. It could look like the theme of masculinity, sure. That's kind of a gimme then, where you can talk about masculinity as powerful, violent, the catalyst of the play, etc. But you can also think about it as a question that recently came up, the relationship between Blanche and Mitch in the play. This is a nice one because adding the analysis of Mitch's character and his masculinity, his presentation of masculinity, perhaps as we spoke about when we looked with Mitch's character as initially hopeful and initially different than Stanley's, but by the end of the play, still brought back to this idea of phallocentric and powerful patriarchal standards. That as soon as Mitch's view of Blanche is different than what he wanted, which is of a virginal or semi-virginal character, as soon as she is revealed not to be that and to have had a past, he becomes violent. He attempts to rape her in a kind of mini scene foreshadowing Blanche's eventual rape by Stanley, which, though Mitch and Stanley are very different at the beginning of the play reveals that they're the same. When their masculinity is challenged, when their view of femininity is challenged, they revert back to this violent and hegemonic masculinity that depends on dominance and depends on women's submission. We've also got here how Williams presents male characters in the play. Now, it's better to think about different elements rather than just say, okay, Stanley 1, Mitch 2. Rather, we'd want to think, okay, Stanley and Mitch, their relationship with class, perhaps at the beginning. Then we want to think about them linked with sex and violence, etc. And then at the end, how do we end? We end on the poker again. So that's linking back to masculine symbols there. Then Stanley is a dominant figure in the play. One of those reasons why he is dominant is as a result of his masculinity, because he, as Stella says, is somehow in control of this drive he has, not as Blanche says, the stamp of genius on his forehead, but he has a drive, this kind of indescribable drive that it's suggested is linked to masculinity as well. And then again, relationships between men and women in the play. Most certainly, we could use an analysis of masculinity to inform how we analyze men and women in the play and their relationships, because their relationships depend on both figures within them mutually supporting and linking to and reinforcing a specific presentation of masculinity as strong and powerful. And when it's challenged, that is when Stella is abused and when Blanche is raped and ultimately destroyed. So if this is your first lesson with us, what we've tended to do in our lessons is look at some lines of argument and how you could use quotations from all across the play. These are quotations from all across the play to create a pattern here across the text. So, for example, the top here in blue says, Stanley Kowalski is a powerfully violent and brutally misogynistic embodiment of patriarchal violence. Now, you'll notice that here we're not talking about... Williams presents Stanley as a powerful character, or that is much more the phrasing of GCSE line of argument, where you're thinking about characters. But in A level, and even if you're trying to get to the level of the highest parts of the mark scheme for GCSE, you want to think about the characters as embodying ideas. What does Stanley embody if we're thinking about masculinity? He embodies patriarchy and its violence and how patriarchy treats women. Like, Stanley is a walking, talking, breathing example of patriarchy, right? He's in control and he is submitting or forcibly submitting anyone or anything that challenges this control to violence, to sexism, and to, if necessary, destruction. Question, is this live? Yes, so feel free to put any questions into the chat or ideas into the chat if you have them across our lesson. Okay, so I'm going to read out some of the quotes and then we'll talk about what stands out to you in terms of devices, in terms of patterns, in terms of symbols that helped us to prove Stanley Kowalski as this powerful embodiment of patriarchal violence. So, for example, in the stage directions at the beginning of the play, he sizes women up at a glance with sexual classifications, crude images flashing into his mind and determining the way he smiles at them. Interesting here because with this sizing women up as a glance, this is a very predatory presentation of Stanley, right? He is literally looking at them, trying to evaluate them, the way that an animal would. So this kind of animalistic presentation immediately. And what is he seeing about them? What is he interpreting about them when he does this? Crude images that determine his response to them. So his sexuality determines then his behavior here. As we can see, because we've got him as a predatory character who is looking at women and sexualizing them, thus objectifying them, right? So the value he places on women is to do with their sexuality or their looks or their capacity to respond to him, or capacity to satisfy him. So this stands out immediately in his first engagement. Notice, not this stage direction is not from his relationship with Stella, but rather the first time he interacts with Blanche, when he comes in and is about to meet Blanche. So interesting, because it foregrounds, then it highlights as important from the beginning, sexuality, predation, and crudeness here. So that being brought to the forefront immediately when he meets Blanche, firstly, implies that they're coming together, the eventual rape, the eventual destruction, the questionably mutual desire is fated from the beginning, because immediately this is brought to our attention. It also immediately makes them stand off as enemies or antitheses, right? Because Blanche, firstly, isn't sizing people up. She's much more blurry, much more rose-tinted glasses, much more willing to cover the truth, paper lanterns, light, gauzy materials, etc. But also, she hates crudeness, right? So they're going to be antagonistic from the beginning here. She tries to cover this up. He openly is staring at her and sort of checking her out. Oof, right? With this as well, we've got Stanley talking to Stella here, saying, all right, I'll wait till she gets through soaking in a hot tub, and then I'll inquire if she's acquainted with the Napoleonic Code. It looks to me that you've been swindled, baby, and when you're swindled under the Napoleonic Code, I'm swindled too, and I don't like to be swindled. Swindled means that you are being tricked out of your money. So firstly, it stands out to us, this idea of fixating on the money here, because it's really the money that initially presents Blanche as a threat to Stanley, right? He thinks that she has done away with the money. She hasn't done. She's lost it, we think, because obviously we never know the truth with this play at all. But this fixation on the idea that he immediately jumps to her tricking him. So again, that kind of predation, that antagonism between the two of them is highlighted here. But also here, this idea of trying to explain to Stella her own sister's behavior is condescending as well, right? And also, with this Napoleonic Code here, suggesting that you're swindled, I'm swindled too. This idea that he particularly doesn't like this, not because Blanche is being nasty or underhanded to Stella, but because in doing so, because he's married to Stella, she is actually doing something to him. So it's his money and his power that's being affected by her supposedly swindling him. And he takes this as a threat. And I don't like to be swindled. This suggests that he is going to take it to task with Blanche and that he is treating this as an affront. So he, through this initial, before even confronting Blanche about Belrev, through this initial description of finding out about Belrev having been lost, is going to investigate. So he doesn't trust Blanche and he's going to investigate. So here, there's fixation on money as a form of power, and also the implied threat in these short sentences and the repetition here. This kind of knowing tone here and condescending tone shows not only that he's speaking down to his wife, but also accusing Blanche. Same with when Blanche asks, poker is so fascinating, could I kibitz, which means could I essentially watch and observe? And he says, you could not. Why don't you women go up and sit with Eunice? So interesting here, short sentence, dismissive tone, and absolutely forbidding manner right here. You could not. These short, almost monosyllabic sentences here suggest that he is very different in his language to Blanche, which again positions them as foils. Poker is so fascinating, that kind of flowery, overwhelming description compared to you could not. The full stop there, the forcefulness of it. It's very aggressive in its language as well. Then interestingly as well, we've got, why don't you women go up and sit with Eunice? So they're interesting. You women, again, belittling and condescending there as well. Very dismissive. And grouping women together and say, well, they might not have anything interesting. They have no interest in spending time with Eunice. But to him, it's just women not allowed here. So he's made, despite the fact that the domestic sphere, so the house, inside of the house is meant to be the women's control, Stanley is in control in this house. And not only is he in control, he is dismissing them and sending them out of the house to go and sit with the upstairs neighbor, because this is a male-dominated sphere, which shows the extent to which and over which his power is existing. And sit up with Eunice. There's an interesting play between up and down in this play, because Stanley and Stella live in the downstairs flat, and Eunice and her husband Steve live upstairs. And they are in the famous sort of Stella scene. Stella comes down to him and sort of lowers herself to him. This is metaphorical in terms of thinking about her class and her choices here to return to Stanley, as well as to give up her upper class power for him, because she's submitting to her desire and decides to be with Stanley. But also introduces this play as these separate spheres here, and also perhaps foreshadows when Stella, before returning to Stanley, does go up to Eunice in order to escape Stanley. So this playing between spheres of the world. Stanley also said, "You're goddamn right, I told him. I'd have that on my conscience the rest of my life if I knew all that stuff and let my best friend get caught." So here is interesting, because we have the power here being absolutely masculine. So Stanley here is talking about telling Mitch, his best friend, that Blanche has kind of a tumultuous past. And he views his duty as warning his best friend Mitch away from Blanche, at the expense of Blanche. Blanche thinks she's going to be saved by Mitch marrying her, which is what he's intending to do. And her problems, financial, positional, etc., will all be solved by that. That being said, he views it as his duty to not let her do this. And notice, court. That verb there is interesting, because Stanley, though he is a predator, also is suggesting that Blanche is some kind of trickster. So got some claws in Mitch. And this is a motif that carries on as well through the end of the play, where the matron says that those nails need to be cut. And when Stanley in the rape scene calls her tiger, for example. So really, Blanche, is very similar to Stanley, whereas they are both animalistic in their sexuality and in their desire, and in the way that their desire and their wants control them. But he's also, this is a patriarchal way to look at a woman, is as tricking and trapping a man, and him willing to destroy her in order to protect another man here. When his power is questioned, so for example in the next quotation, he seizes her arm. This is seizing his wife's arm, so grabbing it hard. So the stage directions being important here to show the violence that's not only normalized but also linked to patriarchy here. He seizes her arm. "Don't ever talk that way to me. Pig, blank, disgusting, vulgar, greasy. Them kinds of words have been on your tongue and your sisters too much around here. What do you two think you are? A pair of queens? Remember what Huey Long said. Every man is a king, and I'm the king around here, so don't forget it." Couple of bits here. Look at this. Seizes her arm, hurls cup and saucer to the floor. So the stage directions are imbued with violence. Here, there is a semantic field of violence across this scene and linked with Stanley's characterization here. There is also absolutely a pattern of forceful and harsh language and imperatives here. Stanley's always speaking in imperatives. And notice almost all of his where sentences are either imperatives or they are questioning and belittling and forcefully reminding. Here, look at the exclamatives, the question marks, the exclamatives. So it is absolutely imbued with violence through the exclamatives, through the repetition, through the harsh tone that's developed through these things, through the semantic field of violence, etc. And then interesting as well, we've got this idea of Huey Long, every man is a king. Huey Long, as we've spoken about before, I think in our lesson on Stanley, was a leftist politician of the time in the South who was advocating for the working classes and saying every man is a king. He means class-wise, everyone has their own power and everyone has control over their own life and domain. He was trying to advocate for the working classes. But the way Stanley is describing that is in terms of class, yes, because he feels belittled by these upper class women being condescending to him, calling him pig, Polak, disgusting, etc. But when he says every man is a king and I am the king around here, so he's reinforcing with that repetition of king, with the allusion to Huey Long, we have this idea of his absolute power here. And he's not even saying, what do you think, you're a pair of queens? He's not saying that he is the king and Stella is the queen. He's saying he is the absolute king here. And that's it. So here, if patriarchal power is questioned, it's responded to with violence. Similarly, with the poker night, and we have poker as this idea of this kind of immoral, at the time it was viewed to be as an activity sort of alongside drinking, alongside gambling of different kinds as well. But then with poker players, Stanley, Steve, Mitch and Pablo, notice we've got all working class men with quite short names, sort of meant to be these approachable everymen, wearing coloured shirts, solid blues, purple, red and white check, light green. They're men at the peak of their physical manhood, coarse and direct and powerful as the primary colours. So this simile here is absolutely crucial to our understanding of masculinity because it is linking it to colour. Now, this is one of the places where we have to take it, because on its own, that is one thing, is that they're talking about this solid, powerful manhood, and this being linked to bright, strong colours. So this sense of strongness or strength, power, dominance, literally like the brightness of it. That would also then be linking it with light. And emphasizing their masculinity as bright and strong, coarse, direct, powerful as primary colours, so as blue, yellow and red. Notice we've got the blue piano, we've got the red pyjamas, we've got yellow light. And here as well, we have to think about Blanche, because Blanche is always wearing white. Colours and white, we know, don't wash together because colours stain white. So we have to think about these colours as symbolic because these colours will stain the whiteness. And because Stanley is particularly linked to red as well as green, so green for progress, but red as this terms of lust, power, devilry perhaps, or evil, literally dressed in red silk pajamas like he's a cartoon devil. But also masculinity and manhood. There's red linked to sort of virility with men and with sort of a phallocentric presentation of Stanley. So then we have to think about this red, this blood being spilled. He is this agent of power and control that will stain Blanche and destroy her. There we are. But this is hinted from the past. This is also linked to, for example, the lights, when we have lights with the rape scene, with the violence, and with the ending there. And Stella, this is the morning after the poker night in the first place? When men are drinking and playing poker, anything can happen. Well, firstly, then we have alcohol and poker linked to drama and volatility. It's always a powder keg, literally something that explodes and like dynamite. So then we're thinking about, okay, masculinity, poker, men, drinking, explosion. When the night of the rape, Stanley is drinking and is a powder keg. He bursts onto the scene and rapes Blanche. And at the end, there's poker as well and drinking. So it suggests this continuity of this violence. That makes sense because in a patriarchy, this violence is normalized and continuous against women whenever they begin to challenge men's power. He didn't know what he was doing. So the normalization then of this violence, not only by Stanley, but also by Stella, who's accepted it. He was as good as a lamb when I came back. And that simile is really powerful as well, because we're thinking about then Stella describing Stanley as a lamb. So innocent, naive, gentle, baby, sacrificial. Even if we think about as good as a lamb, we're then thinking of him as being portrayed as almost the victim here of that conflict, which suggests how far away this is taken from what we would, as modern audiences, interpret in that scene. And it's ironic, right? Because of course we have a different lamb who will be sacrificed for the continuity of Stanley's line here in Blanche. And he was very ashamed of himself, again, normalization, Blanche, and that makes it right, questioning this, perhaps as the more subversive voice of femininity here compared to Stella, who has accepted it and thus submitted to the violence of patriarchy, perhaps because it's the only way she can survive, but still she's done it and Blanche hasn't. Blanche is defiant and thus is punished and destroyed. And that no, it's not all right for anyone to make such a terrible row, but people do sometimes. Stanley's always smashed things. So then we have Stanley and violence being intrinsically linked with that always. This continuity, so then we expect it going forwards and it being excused, and we can even then perhaps infer and predict Stella's reaction to further violence of Stanley, which of course we see at the end of the play when she accepts and refuses to forget or refuses to validate Blanche's version of events because she chooses to believe Stanley's instead about what happened with the rape. With this as well, you lay your hands on me and she backs out of sight. He advances and disappears. There's a sound of a blow. Stella cries out. Blanche screams and runs into the kitchen. The men rush forwards and there's a grappling and cursing. Something is overturned with a crash. Stella says in a high, unnatural voice, out of sight, I want to go away. I want to go away. Here, we have this idea of we don't see it, but we know what's happening here. Right? This is domestic violence. Clear, pure and simple here. And it's interesting because her language, she tries to stop him from doing this, but we don't hear what it was she would do if he hits her, because he hits her. And her language is interrupted here by violence, which suggests that her threat is empty to a certain extent, or even the potential of a threat and a challenge to what he does, lay my hands on you, and we don't have the response, so thus we don't see any alternative of what's going to happen. She says, I want to go away, but this is unclear, right? And this high, unnatural voice here, she is made different. It's almost like she's made more childlike by Stanley's abuse, and thus the power dynamic is reinforced by his violence. So she tries to challenge him, he abuses her, and the power dynamic is exaggerated again. So it becomes more like father and child there. And it's interesting because the men rush forward not to pull Stella away, but to get their hands on Stanley, to stop him from doing anything further. So again, coupled with this my best friend get caught idea, the men respond to the men. They don't respond to the women. So they're not actually protecting Stella. They're trying to stop Stanley from doing something. And as we can see a little bit later, they sort of pet him and soothe him and things, not to sort of say, how dare you treat your wife like that, but calm him down. It says they caress him lovingly, etc. They murmur to him to calm him down like he's a child. He's resting his head on one of their shoulders, etc. It's much more sort of revealing about masculinity there, that they encourage and look after and protect him rather than protecting the person who's more vulnerable in the situation, his pregnant wife who's being abused. And they don't do anything after this to stop her situation. Stanley also says, oh, so you want some roughhouse? All right, let's have some roughhouse. He springs towards her, overturning the table. She cries out and strikes at him with the bottle top, but he catches her wrist. Look at this power and volatility here, this physical violence. Tiger, drop the bottle top, drop it. We've had this date with each other from the beginning. So this sounds like a threat to a certain extent, but also links to this here. So he has imagined this or considered this even from the beginning here. This suggests the fate of it, but this is a patriarch, remember, so we don't want to excuse this as just, oh, well, this was going to happen. We can say this is going to happen because this is what happens in a patriarchy when men's power is threatened by someone like Blanche who doesn't accept his power over her. And notice as well, she moans, the bottle top falls, she sinks to her knees, he picks up her inert figure and carries her to the bed. The hot trumpet and drums from the four deuces sound loudly. So that she is literally, through the stage directions there, sinking into submission there, which is what he wants. And then she faints. He picks her up, so he's then in complete control of her, not only because he's overpowered her in one way by making her drop the bottle top, but literally got her to descend to a level of submission, literally to knees, as if he's a god and she's a human praying. And then she's fainted, so she can't resist as well. She's inert, or in another interpretation, she's just given in, etc. And then he dominates her in a different way by raping her as well. And then the music is linked to that patriarchal lust and dominance as well, and sex just more broadly in the play. And then he crosses to the dressing table and seizes the paper lantern, tearing it off the light bulb and extends it towards her. She cries out if the lantern was herself. Well, this is interesting because here again we have this motif of violence, and also we have her response. He's literally ripped off her illusions. To a certain extent, she is that paper lantern. So that simile is apt there, because we're thinking about him as tearing off her obstacle, her as an obstacle to his life and his progress, his light, in a way. So then we have this idea of him violently destroying her, that ripping and tearing being a little bit of yonic imagery, as well as very violent and unpleasant in terms of thinking about the destructive quality he has, and the fact that she cries out, it's like he's broken her or destroyed her. And if we look at this blue box, these are some critics that are talking about these ideas as well, just to reinforce, to use in your own writing. Remember, with AO5, you're expected to use critics in your work, and the idea is that ideally you would be using a critic at least per paragraph. So these are some who you can feel free to look up and read their articles, but as well, these will help serve you to embed into your analysis and say, well, he is a patriarchal violence. You know who also believes this? Co-Prince, who says, for example, Stanley believes in male superiority. That's the reason why he's doing this, for example. Barnes says Stanley is the animal, the brutal, surviving life force in mankind. So this is describing him as that animalistic, if you're talking about him as a predator and viewing Blanche as a threat, then we can think about him as this kind of will to survive and this animalistic creature here. Brustine describes the conflict between Blanche and Stanley, allegorizes the struggle between effeminate culture and masculine libido. Okay, so if this is the conflict that Blanche and Stanley represent, then he is masculine libido. He is masculine virility and desire here. And the fact that that wins shows the phallocentricity of patriarchal violence and the fact that it is violent in its domination over this effeminate culture, supposedly. Vlasopoulos says, whereas Blanche wants to write Stanley out of history by relegating him to the savage, distant part of prehistory, Stanley is not satisfied with a reductive reading of Blanche. He moves to inscribe, to author, not only her past, but her future. So he's not willing to just let her be a part of the past, as she symbolizes the Old South, and he symbolizes the New South, but rather he is not just going to leave her in the past, he is going to write, and we think about the colors here, write on that blank page, literally her name is blank/white, right, is what it means. He is going to impose his history and his future on her by completely destroying her and ensuring that it is only his way of life that's going to go forwards. With that, we can use that to talk about the colors, the staining, the contrast between white and color, etc. Then Vlasopoulos as well, ultimately Stanley's authority derives from the same sources which most of us are forced to acknowledge in one way or another all our lives. Physical violence, intimidation, and above all, economic domination. So these are the ways that he has control over Stella as well as Blanche here. And that links to ideas like that Napoleonic Code, thinking about the ways, not just one, but many ways he controls Stella's life, and to a lesser extent Blanche's. Vlasopoulos again, in the quest for authority, Stanley profits from staying within the parameters set by him by his sex and class, and Blanche loses because she fails to conform. Stanley is perceived as normal. So Stanley actually, by conforming to hegemonic masculinity, by being dominant, controlling, violent, phallocentric, full of desire, etc., he's actually doing what was the expectation. He's fulfilling the expectations for men at the time. Blanche is subverting them, thus she is punished. Stanley's behavior is viewed as normal or even as something to champion, right? He is clearly the alpha male in the group of poker players. Then with Kuntz as well, Williams seems to be acknowledging that even in the post-war melting pot of regional and ethnic traditions, America is no less chauvinistic than the Old South, and that for women to deny the uneven gender dynamics is naively to accept a position of powerlessness. So here then thinking about, okay, maybe there's this conflict between the New and Old South, but if we're looking intersectionally at how class and gender interact here, then we're thinking about the fact that, okay, class powers and class dynamics might have changed, but women are still oppressed in both Old South and New South. And for women to think that they're equal the way that I think Stella to a certain extent does, is accepting her powerlessness, because she is accepting the fact that she's being oppressed and is allowing it to be normal, as we can see in these quotations. A different way we can think about this, so a completely different paragraph, we can think about and focus on Stanley's brutal sexuality, serving as a method of exerting control over women through physical and sexual domination. So particularly focusing on his sexuality, which, though we've looked at his masculinity, we haven't really focused on his sexuality, because we could have a whole nother paragraph focused on that. For example, the heaving the package at her, the package of meat here, her crying out in protest but managing to catch it, then she laughs breathlessly. This is a sexual innuendo about his control and claim over her as a sexual conquest. So this is meant to be a joke that he's flinging meat at her as if he is claiming and dominating her sexually, and she accepts it and laughs breathlessly. So she even seems to enjoy it here. And because this is both physical, he's throwing something at her, as well as sexual innuendo, this shows that his control and dominance over Stella is both physical and sexual here. Blanche says he had those on when you met him, talking about Stanley's medals in the picture. I assure you I wasn't just blinded by all the brass. So this is Stella saying it wasn't just his medals as accomplishments that impressed her. It's implied that she was impressed by what was underneath this. So his virility, his sexuality, their sex together is really what got her and convinced her to be with Stanley and to marry Stanley. With this as well, this is also introducing this idea of blindness and vision in the play. We play so much with light and dark, but vision and blindness and seeing and not seeing is part of that as well. And we mustn't neglect that, because if we're thinking about Stella as not blinded by brass, but isn't she blind to a certain extent about Stanley and Blanche? Isn't Blanche blind? Stanley is the only one who seemingly can see, and that's part of his power, right? Is that she literally says, you couldn't pull the wool over this boy's eyes, right? So you can't trick me. Whereas Stella perhaps is blinded not by his achievements in the military, but blinded by her desire, her love for Stanley, their physicality, etc. The same with Blanche, when she tries to perhaps innocently flirt with Stanley to get him more on side. She sprays herself with the atomizer, which is the squirty bottle of perfume, then playfully sprays him with it. He seizes the atomizer and slams it down on the dresser. She throws back her head and laughs. If I didn't know that you was my wife's sister, I'd get ideas about you. So here, this atomizer, which is meant to kind of diffuse perfume rather than just having one kind of direct spray, it spreads it out and sort of makes a cloud. Interesting, because Blanche, yes, is trying to flirt with him a bit, but also is perhaps trying to make this cloud of perfumed mist, right? He says, who do you think you're, the Queen of the Nile, spraying perfumes, the empty perfume bottles, etc. at the end. She's trying to control and colour the reality. He doesn't like that, and we can see he responds with violence again, seizes, slams, and this I'd get ideas about you is saying, well, if you weren't my wife's sister, I would think you were flirting with me / trying to seduce me. So here he's firstly responding with violence, and secondly sort of saying, I know you're trying to tempt me sexually into submitting to you. That's not going to happen. So in his behavior as it's presented now, the response we can imagine later when his power is threatened more is going to be more forceful and more violent. Same with Stella when she says, couldn't you call it quits after one more hand? A chair scrapes. Stanley gives a loud whack of his hand on her thigh. And she says, that's not fun, Stanley. So Stella asks for something. She says, can't you stop playing poker after this hand because we want to go to bed and we're tired? And he responds by sort of slapping her on the leg, kind of thigh leg, and it's supposed to be in sort of a sexual way, like he's spanking her. And that is two-part, right? That's you're challenging me, I'm responding with physical / sexual domination, as in you're challenging me, I'm punishing you, / reminding you of your place. But also if we think about spanking and smacking her, that is an indicator of violence, as well as something that at the time would have been a treatment that a parent would have done to a child, right? Spanking them. So this idea of punishment then, if she speaks out and says, well, finish earlier than you want to, he's going to respond with physical violence and punish her. So this then responds to him as a kind of paternalistic, really, figure over her in terms of the extent of his control over his wife. And then that's not fun, Stanley. So she does not like it when he does that. He does it anyway. And this suggests that he does that a lot. It's further in that same scene where he says, I don't like when he does that in company or in front of company. which is important as well, because that suggests A, she's told him about this before, B, that it's the performativity of it, that it's he is with his friends playing poker and drinking, his wife starts to try and telling him what to do, he responds to it. And she doesn't like that in public because that's putting her in her place in public, but is what he is doing on purpose, is reminding the men that he has his wife under control and that she can't question him because he is the king of this house, right? Stanley also says later, Stell, it's going to be all right after she goes and after you've had the baby. It's going to be all right again between you and me the way that it was. You remember the way that it was? Them nights we had together? God, honey, it's going to be sweet when we can make noise in the night the way we used to and get the colored lights going with nobody's sister behind the curtain to hear us. He is suggesting that Blanche plus pregnancy are an obstacle to his sexual enjoyment and domination over his wife, because it's implying that they can't have sex, or they can't have sex the way he wants to, which is making noise and getting the lights going, so turning on colorful lights, without someone literally sleeping behind a curtain dividing it, who would hear otherwise. And that's interesting. Them nights we had together, it's going to be sweet. So this suggests that these are the happy memories, not, I remember we went on a picnic, etc., went out to dinner. No, it's remember all those times that we enjoyed each other and enjoyed having sex together that have been ruined right now. Remember, that's the impetus to getting back to happiness, is we'll be able to get back to having sex the way we want to. And we can see that happens immediately after the conflict when Stella returns to Stanley, and also at the end when Blanche is left and Stanley is feeling for the opening of her blouse. So again, starting that comfort, enjoyment, sweetness suggests this kind of consuming of Stella as well, in sex. So he is the consumer and she is the object to be consumed here. And this idea of lights, colourful lights, notice, and noise compared to Blanche, who is sort of whispers and darkness there. Then as well, finally Stanley stumbles half-dressed out to the porch and down the wooden steps to the pavement before the building. He throws his head like a baying hound and bellows his wife's name. Well, this idea of him being undone, stumbling, throws his head back like a baying hound and bellowing. He's literally calling her like a dog or an animal in heat. An animal looking to mate, and he is calling for her like an animal. This suggests the animalistic nature of his desire, as well as his kind of lack of control without her. This idea of him being half-dressed, sort of this, again, undressed moment, literally emotionally and physically. And this idea of this lust/desire being the most powerful emotion here in the marriage. Standing with heaven-splitting violence, Stella, clarinet, slips down the stairs in her robe. So again, she's not dressed. That would be a completely different image, right, if she were dressed. Whereas she's also similarly half-dressed here. Glistening with tears, her hair loose about her throat and shoulders. It's this idea of her being undone as well. So them being kind of a match in this desire and undoingness. They stare at each other and notice the language in its collective pronouns begins to link them together immediately. Then they come together with low animal moans. He falls to his knees, presses his face to her belly, curving a little with maternity. So here is him asking clearly for forgiveness, him submitting to her as she descends to him submitting to her. Her eyes go blind with tenderness. So there we can see that blindness again with Stella, as she is blinded by love, desire, forgiveness, tenderness, etc., and then forgets that he has hit her that same night. Catches his head, raises him level with her. So she then does away with the class dynamic between them and brings them to equal again. Of course, equal for them is not the case, because he snatches the door open. So violence and sex now. Lifts her off her feet and bears her into the dark flat. So it's implied that immediately after that, it was, they were having sex after this, as Blanche kind of confirms, because she listens at the door in a second to see if they're arguing again or why she's back. So then he's in control again. He lifts her off her feet. And again, notice he does this, but he also does this to Blanche, as we've seen in the rape scene as well. And that violence licks and bears her, so it's like he's back in control here. Same with more sex and domination here. When we first met, me and you thought I was common. How right you was, baby. I was common as dirt. So this idea of commonness and the separation of me and you and I, I. You showed me the statue, the snapshot of the place with the columns. This is Belle Rev. I pulled you down off them columns, and how you loved it, having them coloured lights going. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay until she showed here? Interesting there. Pulled him off the columns. That's metaphorical speaking, right? He wasn't pulling her off the columns, but pulled her off what the columns represent. Her class, her status, her idea of the separation, the hierarchy between them. This symbol of the Old South, those plantation houses with all the columns. And then thinking about the columns, then him pulling her off them, again a descent, but also there's a violence there, right, of pulling off the columns, and how you loved it, having them coloured lights going. So again, it's not how you loved it running free with me in the streets of New Orleans, but how you loved it doing what he is associating with working class, which is having sex, with his experience of raw sexuality and a different way of life. So none of the Southern belle stereotype anymore. She enjoyed the sex with him, so much so that she was pulled off from everything she ever knows, and now she's with him. And wasn't, notice, we happy together. So then that, the sex, brought them together. And wasn't it all okay till she showed here? She, Blanche, is the interruption to the we and the okay. So they were absolutely fine with sex and desire and love solving whatever issues. They had moved on into this new kind of life, evident because she's pregnant as well. Wasn't it all okay until she? So casting her, she, as the enemy here that isn't a hindrance and an obstacle to their happiness and survival as a couple, which of course we know, because Blanche being removed is the return to them being happiness of a couple, etc. With this as well, Stanley comes out in the brilliant silk pajamas, brilliant meaning really bright here, and they're red, we know. And silk, so luxury and this sort of kind of sensual fabric, silk used for undergarments, etc. He grins at her as he knots the tasseled sash about his waist. This sash and the tassel, that is phallic imagery again, a phallic symbol there of him. It's implied sort of drawing attention to his genitalia here and looking at her as he does it, which links this idea of the color red with lust and desire, this phallocentric image, and him looking at her. And this grins, it's also almost as if he's anticipating what's going to happen here, right? And then later in the same scene, tiger, drop the bottle top, drop it. We've had this tape with us from the beginning. So again, this idea of control, him carrying her to the bed, the music raising in it. It's his music. It's the music of the jazz, not the music of the polka. And then at the end, voluptuously, soothingly, now, honey, now, love, now, love. He kneels beside her and his fingers find the opening of her blouse. That's important, right? Because we've got him as comforting her, but the biggest part of his comfort there is sexual fulfillment. So it's implied that he's going to carry her off back into the flat in a minute as well. We don't see that, but we can see his fixation there and his way of soothing. He's saying things, but he's not saying that much, right? He's not saying anything to actually comfort her, but this will comfort her. And that finding the opening of her blouse when she's holding her baby as well, it's this kind of connection between her as a breastfeeding woman, as well as her as this kind of mother of this next generation, as well as him also receiving pleasure, nourishment, growth, continuation, life from his relationship with Stella to a certain extent as well. Again, with Clermont, embodiment of animal force, of brute life, unconcerned and even consciously scornful of every value that's not come in with the scope of such life. So this idea of animal force, this brutality of sexuality is how we could talk about it this way. With Grogan, Stanley, with characteristic violence and in the dead of life, demands that Stella descend to be with him. Even the idea of characteristic violence, right? That's interesting with Grogan to think about. Stanley is absolutely intrinsic in his characterization with violence, that she re-enter his orbit and physical space, a literal descent with many metaphorical resonances. So he doesn't come up the stairs to her and bang on the door and she lets him in there. That would be more asking permission. Here he's calling to her and she comes when he calls. Right? So it shows his control over her in more ways than one. And then Kuntz, Stanley is a man driven principally by passion and instinct, not by reason and will. So this is a man then whose sort of base instinct is pleasure and desire and lust. With masculinity, we've also got to think, as we said, of Mitch, who serves as a submissive masculine foil to Stanley's alpha dominance here. So two different kinds of masculinity here. And we can see that, like with Blanche, when Mitch questions Stanley's dominance and power, he is rebuked and put back in line. So here we have Stanley. When you're losing, I want to eat. When I'm losing, you want to eat. Ante up. Openers. Get your ass off the table, Mitch. Nothing belongs on the table, on a poker table, but cards, chips, and whiskey. He lurches up and tosses some watermelon rinds to the floor. Kind of on your high horse, ain't you? So this idea of imperatives about the other men, definitive statements here, and then when he is sort of annoyed, he's sort of, again, throwing things. Even if he's throwing watermelon rinds to the floor, that's not right? Especially compared to Mitch, whose language uses qualifiers here and tag questions that shows the hesitance and the checking of himself he's doing. He's trying to make his language, or Williams is trying to make his language seem much more tentative than Stanley, who's using exclamatives, question marks, repetition, and definitive statements. Very different to Mitch. There's very much juxtaposition there in the characters. Same with Mitch here. I'm out again. I ought to go home pretty soon. Shut up. I got a sick mother. She don't go to sleep until I come in at night. Then why don't you stay at home with her? She says to go out, so I go, but I don't enjoy it. All the time I keep wondering how she is. Oh, for the sake of Jesus, go home then. Look at the language again. Monosyllabic here. Jesus really being our longest syllable word there, really. And this is indicative, right? That monosyllabic language compared to and different in the representation of, on the use of repetition here, because Mitch, I'm out, I ought to go home, sick mother, go out, etc. So this idea of indecision, of tentativeness, of submission to a certain extent, to Stanley's impatience, He just said, wait, stay or go. Don't care. Get on with it. And the emotion of Mitch and the justification of Mitch makes him seem much more submissive and such a foil to Stanley, who doesn't explain himself more than necessary, or sometimes even at all. And his impatience is so clear here, right? Then with, you all are married, but I'll be alone when she goes. I'm going to the bathroom. Hurry back and we'll fix you a sugar tit. I'll go rut. So here showing the difference, Stanley as this virile husband and man who has a baby on the way, has a wife. He is absolutely the fulfillment of hegemonic masculinity. He's got a wife who does what he says, who, when he throws watermelon rinds on the floor, she cleans them up without complaining. Has a baby so he can prove his masculinity, and he's going to pass on the next generation, compared to Mitch, who seemingly can't find a woman to get married to, and Stanley being this all-knowing, more virile character, says we'll introduce you to a prostitute or a sex worker here, by saying that as in, you can't get one yourself, so I know where to find them, I'll sort you out, type of thing. So again, showing he is the much more dominant character who has and achieves sexual satisfaction and also knows about it, whereas Mitch is much more uncertain and tentative, which is probably why he goes for Blanche, who seems that way as well. This idea then of, even when he tries to defend himself, kind of in rutting, implying that Stanley is sort of showing off his dominance here, it's qualified again with "all." So, and it's short, as in he's saying it on his way out, and it's not a real toe-to-toe with Stanley kind of trying to embarrass him publicly there. Blanche saying, is he a wolf? Why Stanley? Blanche laughs. I don't think he would be. This questioning of, if he's a wolf, is he a predator? Is he going to be a bad guy player kind of thing? Whereas with Stanley, we know he's a wolf. He sizes women up. He bares his teeth in that grin. He is watching and violent and springs on people, etc. Whereas Mitch, his wolfness, his predatory alpha masculinity is questioned, and Stella reinforces this by saying, I don't think he would be. So he's not a wolf, whereas Stanley is, which shows the difference between them, because Stella says that Stanley is on the precision bench. Oh no, that Mitch is on the precision bench. So very different from the traveling salesman. In the spare parts department at the plant Stanley works for. Spare parts department. So he's doing all the detail work. So again, suggesting a sensitivity there, an attention to detail, which makes sense because Mitch focuses on details like his sweat and his figure, whereas Stanley doesn't care. And review that as an effeminate quality. Obviously, modern interpretation would be completely different, but in Stanley's view, in this time period, that might have been it. And in the spare parts department, Williams didn't have to include that detail. He did include that detail because it suggests there is kind of a uselessness to Mitch that there isn't to Stanley. Stanley is the only one of his crowd that's likely to get anywhere. So this idea that Mitch is useless. Is that something much? No. That short condemnation of Mitch as essentially useless, which is why perhaps someone like Stella would go for someone like Stanley instead, because he's willing to get, or likely to get, somewhere. And Mitch isn't, because he doesn't have the drive that Stanley does. Stanley says he was looking through them drapes. This is him talking to the poker players about Mitch. So he is noticing what Mitch is doing. His focus is distracted. He's looking at Blanche. And he jumps up and jerks roughly at the curtains to close them. So he doesn't like that Mitch is looking at Blanche rather than focusing on the game, what Stanley wants him to focus on. He is also, again, king of his house. So showing the dominance of, this is my house, don't look where you're not meant to be looking, particularly in a bedroom, which is where the women are, and closes the curtain. So is literally controlling the vision of the people in this house. Not just Blanche and Stella, but also Mitch. Highlights his power again. Blanche says she ran downstairs and went back in there with him. Mitch says, sure she did. Ho, there's nothing to be scared of. They're crazy about each other. So this idea that he even accepts the idea that Stella is always going to go back to Stanley because he knows how dominant Stanley is and clearly how proficient Stanley is sexually, in terms of fulfilling Stella's desire, in terms of control over Stella. And this also indicates how deeply Stella is entrenched in this relationship as well, that it's not only normalized but completely obvious to Mitch that Stella will return to Stanley. And then the same for here, Stanley calling, like with Stella, calling Mitch, summoning him from the table. Deal me out, I'm talking to Miss Dubois. Stanley bellowing, Mitch, coming. Gracious, what lung power. So here, the summoning here, and also what happens when someone doesn't come when they're called, screams it. And what does Mitch do? Comes. So he can resist once, but he can't resist twice. Especially when Stanley sort of really flexes his power. This is the part here where we're talking about Stanley and men. Mitch said, get him in here, men. Stanley is forced, pinioned by the two, so his arms held against himself, into the bedroom. Interesting that. He nearly throws them off. Then all at once he subsides and is limp in their grasp. They speak quietly and lovingly to him, and he leans his face on one of their shoulders. Poker shouldn't be played in a house with women. Stanley, dully, what's the matter? What happened? You just blew your top, Stan. So firstly, Mitch is the one that knows how to look after Stanley. Secondly, Stanley is so powerful that even with two men holding his arms back and forcing him into the bedroom, he's able nearly to throw them off him, which suggests his power is emphasized. It's more than almost double a normal man's. And then it's only when he gives up that they're able to control him, and they look after him. He's this sort of center, the masculine center of him. They speak to him as these, I wouldn't say necessarily sycophantic, but certainly submissive beta men trying to look after their alpha in a way. And he leans to this idea of sort of submission, but also this idea of sort of centrality to Stanley compared to the others here. This idea that maybe they're a little bit scared of him, a little bit overpowered by him as well. And then what can they say? This speaking lovingly and quietly to them, this passive language of poker shouldn't be played in a house with women. No. What should be said is, Stanley, you should not hit your wife, regardless. But here, it's suggested that poker and women in contact is the problem, not men's volatility. So here, excusing and allowing Stanley's behavior to be normalized here, as well as that you just blew your top. This explosiveness of Stanley compared to the other characters, A, but B, showing this kind of cool and response to him. He answers him and sort of trivializes it to a certain extent. Stanley as well. Mitch is a buddy of mine. We're in the same outfit together. 241st engineers. The same outfit means the same regiment of their army. We work in the same plant and now on the same bowling team. You think I could face him if Stanley Kowalski? Did you repeat what that? You're goddamn right. I told him I'd have that on my conscience for the rest of my life if I knew all that stuff and let my best friend get caught. So this idea that to Stanley, he has to save the day. He has to protect him. And again, he is willing to protect his submissive friend who clearly can't see for himself what Blanche is. With Stella, I said, is Mitch through with her? Blanche's voice is lifted again, serenely as a bell. She sings, but it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me. And Stanley, no, I don't think he's necessarily through with her, just wised up. Well, that's one thing, is Stanley being the voice of his truth / light / reality to Mitch, to Blanche, and to Stella. So he's the one that is in control of the information. And his influence is going to inform Mitch's future behavior. And Mitch, we'll see after this, behaves more like Stanley, the kind of imitation of Stanley, in that he attempts to rape Blanche and creates a huge and violent scene and then allows her to be destroyed. And in the final stage directions here, not of the play, but on this page, obviously, at the sound of Blanche's voice, Mitch's arm supporting his cards has sagged, his gaze is dissolved into space. Stanley slaps him on the shoulders. Hey, Mitch, come to. So this idea that Mitch clearly feels guilty for his role in Blanche's future and Blanche's life now, because she's clearly been completely destroyed. But it's shown as a kind of weakness, right? Limp, sagged, dissolved. Stanley slaps him on the shoulder, again, forcing, like with the Mitch bellowing, to him to return to this masculine space and demanding that he do what Stanley tells him to do. This is interesting. Gilbert says that his boyish fragility clearly opposed to Stanley's brutish strength. So here we have clear opposites there. Thompson says from the beginning of their relationship, Blanche attempts to elevate Mitch to the romanticized status of the idealized Alan Gray because he shares his softness and tenderness. These are words that would never describe Stanley, right? And this idea that Mitch can be romanticized. Stanley cannot. Stella is not blinded by the brass. She is very aware of what Stanley is and isn't. She just accepts it, whereas Blanche can't accept reality, which is why partly the relationship with Mitch fails, but also why she is unable to survive the play. Al-Nama says the play is therefore looked in terms of binary oppositions. So in terms of masculinity, there are binary oppositions, but also in terms of masculinity versus femininity, those presentations are completely opposite. Al-Nama also says all that he can do is walk in the shadow of the towering figure of Stanley, the tough man, the virile husband, and the symbol of the thrusting forces of the new world. So even Mitch doesn't seem like he's going to do that well in the new world, because he ends the play weak, sobbing, yes, continuing on in the poker, but unmarried, no child. So the kind of weaker forces here, if we're talking evolutionarily, it's going to be Stanley, Stella, and his son that survive, and these weaker forces will die out because they're not able to procreate. Al-Nama also says Mitch is the opposite of Stanley in almost every single trait. This could also be used to, interestingly, as we looked at with Mitch before, to show, well, yes, he is the opposite, but as a result of the patriarchy, they still end the same place. They still end with sexual violence when questioned and the destruction of women. We can think about Mitch in terms of his initially sympathetic, non-hegemonic masculinity, providing a sense of hope for Blanche's future immediately, with this idea of him being sensitive, this focus of the mother, with this idea of, again, fixation on the mother, his sensitivity to his mother, his obedience, his worry about her, his deep love for his mother. He seems different than Stanley, whereas he doesn't care. This awkward courtesy and this kind of mimicking of upper class speech here, and the same with the tags to his language, the politeness of his language, the awkwardness of his language. etc. The slowness glancing back compared to Stanley, who strides and rips and tears. Stanley, when he goes home, he'll deposit them one by one in a piggy bank his mother gave him for Christmas. The game is spit in the ocean. Mitch is uncomfortable, clearly, in this hegemonic masculinity. He is much more loving and sweet, whereas Stanley's like, the game is spit in the ocean. It's kind of crass and gross. And this idea of, unlike Stanley, who rips and tears open doors and rips curtains back and forth, he sort of stands in this liminal space in the doorway, which suggests that he is in this kind of threshold between the two worlds. Blanche says as well, if God should choose, I shall love thee better after death. This is a poetry quotation. And so Mitch, again, showing to be sensitive, perhaps much more like Blanche. Blanche says, you talked to your mother about me, how nice you were, and I liked you. So this idea of hope for Blanche that he would potentially marry her. Mitch moving in awkward imitation. Of course, it is only awkward imitation. He can't be Alan Gray. He is an awkward imitation of Alan Gray, and thus not what will save Blanche or will give Blanche back her past at all. And this is clear because even in this idea of hope, it's not hope of him, it's hope of rest, breathe quietly, not being anyone's problem. So escape, really. He's an escape for her. And him starting towards the bedroom in the last scene, but Stanley blocking him, pushing him aside, lunges and strikes at Stanley with hope. Oh, maybe he'll take down Stanley and Blanche will be saved or recovered or left in peace. But Stanley pushes him back and he collapses, sobbing. So he can't actually make any change here. He's really presented here as weak, right? And this hope is now hopeless. Again, boyish fragility, looking for Alan in herself, but also looking for Alan in others. We know that that's not the case. She doesn't achieve that. And of course not, because it's futile to do so. And Mitch at the beginning does offer Blanche a sort of mirroring, so showing him then as a kind of masculinity that's actually linked much more to femininity. He speaks more to the wives, or to Stella and to Blanche, than he is shown speaking in the Poker Nights, for example. Blanche is deeply moved by his love and compassion for his mother, feelings that remind her of the typical attitude of members of the traditional Southern society. So his love for his mother is sort of an echoing of traditional Southern values, which perhaps shows this link, this kind of etiquette, this gentlemanly behavior that perhaps is not lost. But, of course, he is also looking for something that is not real by idealizing Blanche. He is writing his own ideas of her, on her, hence Blanche again, as well as thinking of him as equally not just weak compared to Stanley, but weak in terms of standing up for what is right. And then Alnama, again, although Mitch is described as dull and foolish, the play shows him to be more sophisticated and more capable than Stanley at making Blanche lay her cards on the table. So here, although it's a different kind of masculinity that is weak in comparison to Stanley's, it also is, in a way, stronger. He gets more out of Blanche in terms of her actual feelings and truth, etc., whereas Stanley scares her and they're so opposing that they'll only be antagonistic. That, I hope, has given you some ideas for masculinity for A Streetcar Named Desire. We're going to be looking next week, same time, for ideas on femininity, so we can see again the reverse coin of this. So I hope that you found something that you'll be able to introduce into your writing in order to make it broader, stronger, deeper, more complex, more nuanced, etc. Hope this has been a good review if you are coming up to mocks, and we will be continuing this series until the end of January. If this is your first video you've seen of us, I've also done a whole unit on Othello that gives characters, themes, plot, context, critics, essays, everything. And then we will carry on with A Streetcar Named Desire. And after that, continue on to our next texts. So hope to see you for one of our next lessons. Hopefully next week. We're running across the year from 6:50 until 8:20 every Wednesday evening. Look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now. Bye.